In this emotional journey, we follow Evan and Tyler Fisher, a family torn apart by grief and betrayal. After losing his mother, Tyler struggles to find his place in a home that feels increasingly hostile, especially under the harsh rule of his new stepmother. But when she makes a decision that shatters their fragile family, Tyler is left alone to fend for himself, and Evan is forced to confront the truth he's been avoiding. Will Evan be able to make things right before it's too late? Can Tyler find the strength to forgive and rebuild his life after everything he's been through? If you love stories that dive deep into the complexities of family, healing, and hope, stick around, because this one will take you through moments of heartbreak and triumph you won't want to miss. Make sure to hit the subscribe button, like, and leave a comment below to let us know your thoughts on this emotional journey. Now, let's dive into the story of Evan and Tyler Fisher. The Fisher household wasn't exactly broken, but it had long stopped feeling whole. Evan Fisher stood at the kitchen counter, brewing his morning coffee, already dressed for another day of meetings. The faint clatter of the coffee maker was the only sound filling the room. His son Tyler shuffled into the kitchen a few minutes later, head down, eyes glued to his phone. "Morning, Bud," Evan said, offering a strained smile. Tyler nodded, his lips pressed into a thin line. At 14, Tyler Fisher was quieter than most boys his age. 3 years had passed since Emily, his mother, died from cancer. But Tyler still hadn't found his footing in a world without her. His once vibrant personality had dimmed, his natural curiosity replaced by an impenetrable silence. Evan tried his best, he really did, but between his demanding job and Tyler's constant withdrawal, the gap between them felt more like a canyon. "Big day at school?" Evan asked, sipping his coffee. "Not really," Tyler mumbled, sliding into a chair. His fingers hovered over his phone, texting someone, probably one of his few friends. Evan sighed, giving up on trying to pull more than a 2-word response from him. Tyler had changed after Emily's death, and Evan had struggled to find a way to reach him. The clattering of high heels on the hardwood floor signaled Lindsay's entrance. Evan's second wife swept into the room, a whirlwind of expensive perfume and perfect makeup. Lindsay had been a nurse before their marriage, and now she spent most of her days redecorating the house or meeting her friends for long lunches. She loved Evan, but her patience with Tyler had never been strong. Lindsay smiled at Evan before her eyes flickered toward Tyler, her expression hardening ever so slightly. "Morning, Tyler," she said, her voice sharp. "Morning," Tyler responded, not looking up. Evan noticed the flicker of annoyance in Lindsay's eyes, but she quickly masked it, turning her attention back to him. "I have lunch with Karen and Laura today," she announced, ignoring Tyler as he picked at his cereal. "We're talking about the charity gala coming up next month. I was thinking of wearing that new dress." "That sounds great," Evan said, though his mind was already preoccupied with the day's work ahead. Tyler finished his breakfast in silence and retreated to his room, leaving Evan and Lindsay in the kitchen. As soon as Tyler was gone, Lindsay let out a long sigh. "He barely speaks to me, Evan," she said, folding her arms. "I know he's had a hard time, but it's been 3 years. He needs to stop acting like the world owes him something." Evan winced. "Hez still grieving. You know that. I'm not saying I don't understand, but it's exhausting, Evan. He ignores me, never talks to me. I don't know what to do with him." Lindsay's frustration was palpable, and Evan, as always, was caught in the middle. "He'll talk to him," Evan promised, though he wasn't sure what good it would do. Every conversation with Tyler ended in silence or one-word answers. As he kissed Lindsay goodbye and left for work, Evan told himself that things would get better eventually. He had to believe that. The tension in the house simmered for weeks, but it was always there, like a constant hum in the background. Tyler spent most of his time in his room, headphones on, eyes glued to his computer screen. He wasn't an angry kid, he didn't slam doors or yell, but his silence weighed heavy on the house. Lindsay tried to engage with him, but her attempts always ended in frustration. Tyler's short responses felt like defiance, though Evan wasn't sure that was fair. Still, it was hard to deny that Lindsay's patience was wearing thin. One evening, after another silent dinner, Lindsay finally broke. "Evan, I can't keep living like this," she said, setting her fork down. I don't want to feel like an outsider in my own home. Evan rubbed his temples, feeling the familiar pang of guilt. I know it's tough, Lindsay, but he's still processing everything. He needs time. Lindsay shook her head. I'm not asking for miracles, Evan, but it's been 3 years. I've tried God. I've tried, but he doesn't want me here. He barely even looks at me. Evan sighed. He's not trying to hurt you. Maybe not. But that doesn't change the fact that I feel like I'm living with a stranger. And you're gone so much for work. I'm the one who has to deal with it all. I'm trying, Lindsay, Evan said, his voice quieter now. He'll talk to him again. But deep down, he knew talking wouldn't solve it. He was trying to balance too much, his job, his marriage, and his role as a father. And in the process, everything was slipping through his fingers. It all came crashing down on a Friday night. Evan had left that morning for a week-long business trip to Chicago. Tyler was already up when he left, barely offering a wave from the kitchen doorway. Lindsay had kissed Evan goodbye, smiling brightly, though her eyes were clouded with something darker, something Evan hadn't noticed until it was too late. Lindsay's patience had finally run dry. That night, Tyler was sitting at the dinner table, lost in thought. Lindsay had made spaghetti, her favorite, but Tyler barely touched his plate. He reached for his water glass, his hand shaking slightly as his thoughts drifted to his mother. In a moment of carelessness, his fingers knocked the glass over. Water spilled across the table, splashing onto Lindsay's lap. Lindsay jumped up with a shriek, her eyes blazing with fury. "You clumsy, useless boy," she yelled, wiping at the water with a napkin. "Can't you do anything right?" Tyler stammered an apology, eyes wide with shock, but Lindsay wasn't done. "I'm sick of this," she continued, her voice rising. "Sick of tiptoeing around you, sick of your sulking, your silence. You're not a child anymore, Tyler. Grow up!" Tyler's heart raced, his mind reeling from the sudden explosion of anger. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, but Lindsay's next words stopped him cold. "Your mother's gone, Tyler crying won't bring her back, and making everyone miserable won't help either." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. Tyler's chest tightened as tears welled up in his eyes, but Lindsay didn't stop. "I've had enough of this. Enough of you!" She stormed out of the dining room, leaving Tyler frozen in shock. A few minutes later, Lindsay returned, a duffel bag in her hands. She threw it at his feet. "Pack your things," she said coldly. "I want you out." Tyler stared at her, disbelief washing over him. "What? Where am I supposed to go?" "I don't care," Lindsay snapped. "I've had it with you. Pack your bag and get out." Trembling, Tyler did as he was told. He stuffed clothes into the bag, grabbed his phone, and slipped a framed photo of his mother into his pocket. As he zipped up the bag, the weight of reality settled on him. "Please," he whispered, "don't do this. It'll be better, I promise." But Lindsay's expression was as hard as stone. She grabbed his arm, dragging him to the front door. "You're not welcome here anymore, Tyler." With that, she shoved him outside, slamming the door behind him. Tyler stood there, his duffel bag in hand, staring at the door in disbelief. He knocked, calling her name, but there was no response. As the evening turned to night, Tyler realized the truth: he had nowhere to go. The night air was colder than Tyler expected. His breath formed small clouds as he wandered the streets, unsure of what to do. He pulled out his phone, staring at the dark screen. Should he call someone? His father? His friends? But shame flooded his mind. What would he say? That his stepmother had kicked him out? That he had nowhere to go? No, he couldn't do that. He couldn't bear the thought of anyone knowing how far things had fallen apart. He wandered for hours, the streets growing quieter as the night deepened. Finally, he stumbled into a small parkone he used to visit with his mother when he was younger. He found a bench and sat down, clutching his duffel bag tightly to his chest. His stomach growled and his head throbbed, but all he could think about was the house he had just been thrown out of, the home that no longer felt like home. As the cold seeped into his bones, Tyler pulled his jacket tighter around him, tears slipping down his cheeks. He hadn't felt this lost since the day his mother died. The pain was different this time, but just as crushing. "Dad, where are you?" Tyler whispered into the night, though he knew his father was hundreds of miles away, unaware of the storm that had just shattered their family. Evan Fisher sat in his hotel room, staring out the window as the city of Chicago spread beneath him. It had been a long day filled with back-to-back meetings, but despite his exhaustion, he couldn't sleep. His mind was drifting to home, to Tyler, and to the strained silence that had become their norm. He checked his phone, no texts from Lindsay or Tyler. That wasn't unusual, but something felt off tonight. Just as he was about to set his phone down and force himself to sleep, it buzzed in his hand. A call. The screen lit up with Mrs. Rodriguez, their neighbor. "Hello," Evan answered, suddenly alert. "Evan, I'm so sorry to bother you," Mrs. Rodriguez said, her voice laced with concern. "But I saw Tyler leaving the house earlier with a bag." He looked upset. Evan sat up straighter, his heart quickening. "What do you mean, a bag? Where was he going?" "I don't know, Mrs. Rodriguez replied. "I asked Lindsay about it when I saw her, but she said he was staying with friends. Something about giving him space. It didn't sit right with me, though." Evan felt a wave of dread rise in his chest. Tyler leaving the house without telling him, something was wrong, deeply wrong. "Thank you for calling, Mrs. Rodriguez," Evan said, his voice tight. "He'll take care of it." The moment he hung up, Evan's hands were already dialing Lindsay's number. It rang once, twice, 3 times, before finally going to voicemail. Frustration and panic began to swirl together in his chest. "Pick up, Lindsay," he muttered, trying again. On the 3rd try, Lindsay finally answered, her voice groggy with sleep. "Evan, what's going on? It's the middle of the night." "Where's Tyler?" Evan demanded, skipping the pleasantries. His voice was sharp, filled with the panic he was trying to contain. There was a pause. Too long to be innocent. "Hez staying with friends," Lindsay finally said, her tone neutral, calculated. Which friends? Evan's voice was louder now. "He didn't tell me anything about this." "What's going on, Lindsay?" Another pause. Then, Lindsay's voice grew defensive. He was being difficult. "Evan. He was sulking around, making messes, ignoring me. I couldn't take it anymore. I told him to leave for a few days, to cool off. I thought it would be good for him, give him some perspective." Evan's blood ran cold. "You did what?" His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "I told him to leave," Lindsay repeated, her earlier bravado faltering. "I didn't mean for it to be permanent, Evan. I assumed he'd come back or call you." Evan gripped the phone tighter, his knuckles white. "You kicked my 14-year-old son out of the house in the middle of the night, and you didn't think to tell me." Lindsay's voice wavered now. "I thought he needed to learn some responsibility, Evan. He's been impossible to live with." Evan's mind reeled. His son, his grieving son, had been cast out like he didn't matter. Anger and fear surged through him. "I'm coming home. Right now," he said, his voice barely controlled. "And Lindsay, you better hope we find him safe." He didn't wait for a response. He hung up the phone, already throwing clothes into his suitcase, his heart pounding in his chest. His mind was filled with images of Tyler alone, scared, wandering the streets. He booked the earliest flight back to his town, his hands trembling as he did so. As the minutes ticked by, the weight of what had happened pressed down on him like a heavy blanket. He had failed Tyler. He had trusted Lindsay to care for his son, and she had betrayed that trust in the worst way possible. Evan made a vow right then and there he would find Tyler, and nothing would ever come between them again. The cold was the first thing Tyler noticed when he woke up. His body ached from spending the night on a park bench, and for a moment he was disoriented. His eyes blinked open, staring up at the dim early morning sky. Where was he? Why wasn't he in his bed? Then it all came crashing back, the argument, Lindsay's words, the door slamming shut behind him. The reality of being kicked out of his own home. Tyler sat up slowly, rubbing his arms to warm himself. His stomach growled, a harsh reminder that he hadn't eaten since the previous night's disastrous dinner. He glanced around the park. There was no one around. It was early, too early for people to be out yet. He grabbed his duffel bag and slung it over his shoulder, his legs stiff as he stood. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to keep moving. The streets felt emptier this early in the morning, quieter, but not in a peaceful way. More in a way that made Tyler feel even more alone than he already did. His mind raced. He could go to his friend Daniel's house, but Daniel lived on the other side of town, too far to walk. He could call him, But how would he explain what happened? The shame was too much to bear. His phone buzzed in his pocket. For a fleeting moment, Tyler thought it might be his dad, calling to check on him. But when he pulled the phone out, the screen was empty. He had no missed calls, no messages. The silence from his father was deafening. Tyler wandered the streets for hours, his legs growing weaker as hunger gnawed at him. By the time the sun was high in the sky, he had found his way to another park. He sat on a bench, watching people go by, people with homes, people who didn't know what it felt like to be abandoned. He hated Lindsay for what she had done, but more than that, he hated the gnawing fear that maybe his dad didn't care. Maybe his dad knew and wasn't coming for him. By the time afternoon came, desperation set in. He had no money, no food, and nowhere to go. The few dollars in his pocket wouldn't get him far, and his stomach growled louder with each passing minute. He was too ashamed to ask anyone for help, so he did the only thing he could think of. He checked trash cans near restaurants, hoping to find something to eat. His hands shook with embarrassment as he pulled out half-eaten sandwiches, but he was too hungry to care. When night fell again, Tyler found himself in yet another park, this time huddled behind some bushes to keep warm. The stars overhead were bright, but Tyler felt nothing but darkness in his chest. He curled up with his duffel bag as a pillow, his body shivering against the cool air. As he drifted into an uneasy sleep, tears rolled down his cheeks. He missed his dad. He missed his mom.
He missed the home he no longer had.
Evan didn't know what real fear was until now. His flight back home had felt like an eternity, every minute a reminder that Tyler was out there, alone. When his plane finally landed, Evan barely remembered to grab his suitcase before rushing through the airport. His mind focused on one thing: finding his son. The drive home was no better. His knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, scanning the streets for any sign of Tyler. He passed familiar places, the school, the park where Tyler used to play, but there was no sign of him. When Evan finally arrived home, the first thing he did was storm through the front door, his heart pounding. Lindsay was sitting on the couch, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. "Where is he?" Evan's voice was low, but the fury behind it was unmistakable. Lindsay stood up, wringing her hands nervously. "I don't know, Evan. I haven't seen him since." "You told me he was staying with friends," Evan interrupted, his voice sharp as a knife. "You kicked him out of the house, and you didn't even tell me. How could you do that?" "He was impossible," Lindsay cried, her own frustration bubbling to the surface. "He was always moping around, never speaking, making messes. I couldn't take it anymore." "Hez a grieving child," Evan roared, his anger finally spilling over. "Hez lost his mother, and now he's lost his home. You threw him out, Lindsay. You threw him away like he didn't matter." Lindsay's shoulders sagged, her earlier defensiveness evaporating. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I thought he'd come back. I thought he'd call you." Evan's chest tightened with rage, but he forced himself to stay focused. "I'm going to find my son," he said coldly, turning away from her. "And when I do, we'll talk. But right now I have to find him." He left without another word, the door slamming behind him. Evan drove through the darkened streets, his eyes scanning every corner, every alley, every park bench. He showed Tyler's picture to anyone who would listen. People at gas stations, bus stops, even homeless shelters. Some looked sympathetic, others shook their heads, but no one had seen his son. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning, when Evan found himself in a rundown part of town he barely recognized, that something finally changed. He spotted a small park tucked between two dilapidated buildings, and something in his gut told him to stop. He got out of the car and walked slowly through the park, his breath visible in the cold air. His footsteps crunched on the frost-covered grass, and then he heard a soft sound, like a whimper, coming from behind a cluster of overgrown bushes. Evan pushed through the branches, his heart pounding in his chest. There, curled up on the cold ground, was Tyler. "Tyler," Evan breathed, dropping to his knees beside his son. Tyler stirred, his eyes fluttering open. For a moment he looked disoriented, but then recognition flooded his face, followed by disbelief. "Dad," Tyler's voice was hoarse, his lips chapped from the cold. Evan gathered Tyler into his arms, holding him tightly as his own tears fell. "I'm so sorry," Evan whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. I should have been there. I should have known." Tyler sobbed against his father's chest, clinging to him like a lifeline. "Please don't send me away again," Tyler whispered, his voice trembling. "It'll be better, I promise." Evan pulled back just enough to look into Tyler's tear-streaked face. "No, Tyler, you don't have to be better. I'm the one who's sorry. You're coming home and I'm never letting you go again." As Evan helped Tyler to his feet, wrapping him in the blanket he kept in the car, a sense of relief washed over him. He had found his son, and nothing was going to come between them again. The car ride back home was quiet, with only the soft hum of the heater cutting through the stillness. Tyler sat in the passenger seat, wrapped in the blanket his dad had given him. He looked small, fragile, as he stared out the window, his eyes distant. Evan kept glancing at his son, the reality of what had happened weighing heavily on his heart. Every now and then, Tyler would sniffle, wiping at his nose with the back of his hand. Evan didn't push him to talk. He knew better than to overwhelm him with questions. The boy had been through enough. For now, just having Tyler in the car, heading home, was enough for Evan. As they pulled into the driveway, Tyler tensed visibly. Evan noticed and put a hand on his shoulder. "It's okay," he said gently. "You don't have to be afraid anymore." Tyler didn't respond, but he nodded slightly. The house loomed in front of them, dark and quiet. Lindsay was inside, Evan knew, waiting. But right now, she wasn't his priority, Tyler was. As they walked up to the front door, it swung open, and Lindsay stood there, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. When she saw Tyler, she let out a small gasp and took a step forward. "Thank God," she breathed. But Evan quickly put a protective arm around his son, guiding him past her. "Not now," Evan said, his voice low and firm. "Tyler needs rest." "Well, talk later." Lindsay's face crumpled, but she didn't protest. She watched as Evan led Tyler upstairs to his room, her eyes filled with regret and fear. But Evan couldn't deal with that now. He had more important things to take care of. Tyler paused in the doorway of his room, looking around as if seeing it for the first time in ages. His bed was made, his posters were still on the walls, his belongings untouched. It was as if nothing had changed, but Tyler's expression said otherwise. "It's still here," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Evan's heart broke a little more. "Of course it is, son. This is your home. It always will be." He helped Tyler get cleaned up, guiding him to the bathroom and handing him a fresh set of clothes. Tyler moved slowly, his body still stiff from the cold and his time spent on the streets. When he finally climbed into bed, Evan sat on the edge, watching as his son curled up under the blankets. "Don't go," Tyler whispered, his voice small and afraid. "Please don't leave me again." Evan's chest tightened. "I'm not going anywhere, Tyler," he said softly, kicking off his shoes and lying down next to his son. He pulled him close, holding him like he had when Tyler was little, when a nightmare would wake him up in the middle of the night. "I promise," Evan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm right here." As Tyler drifted off to sleep, his breathing slow and steady, Evan lay awake, his mind racing. He had so many questions, so many things he needed to say to Lindsay, but those could wait. For now, all that mattered was that Tyler was safe. They had a long road ahead of them, but at least they were walking it together. The next morning, the house was eerily quiet. Evan stood at the kitchen counter, making a pot of coffee, his mind replaying the events of the past few days. He felt exhausted, not just physically but emotionally. He knew the confrontation with Lindsay was inevitable, but he dreaded it. He had no idea how things could ever go back to the way they were if they even should. Tyler was still asleep upstairs, and Evan planned to let him rest as long as he needed. The boy had been through hell, and Evan wasn't going to rush him back into the normal routine. In fact, he wasn't even sure what normal meant anymore. Lindsay walked into the kitchen, her hair disheveled, her eyes still puffy from crying. She didn't say anything at first, just stood by the doorway, watching Evan as he poured himself a cup of coffee. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, breaking the silence. Evan didn't look at her. He took a slow sip of his coffee, letting the warmth spread through him, trying to steady his emotions. "Sorry," he repeated, his voice cold. "You're sorry. Lindsay stepped forward, her hands clasped in front of her. I didn't mean for things to go this far, Evan. I was just so frustrated, and he was so difficult to live with. I thought he'd come back, or that you would talk to him. I didn't mean— You didn't mean to kick my son out of his own home, Evan cut in, his voice rising. You didn't mean to throw a 14-year-old boy onto the streets, because that's what you did, Lindsay. You abandoned him. Lindsay flinched at his words, her eyes filling with tears again. I didn't know what else to do, she cried. He's been impossible, Evan. He doesn't talk, he doesn't engage, he just mopes around, making everything feel heavy. I felt like I was living with a stranger in my own house. Evan slammed his coffee cup down on the counter, the sound echoing through the kitchen. You were living with a child who lost his mother, he shouted. A child who was still grieving, still trying to figure out how to move on. And instead of helping him, instead of being patient, you pushed him away. You pushed him out. Lindsay's shoulders sagged, her earlier bravado gone. I didn't mean to hurt him, she whispered, sinking into a chair. I was just so angry. I thought if I gave him some space, if I forced him to see the consequences of his actions, he'd come around. Evan shook his head, his chest tight with anger and sadness. He's not some rebellious teenager who needs to be taught a lesson, Lindsay. He's a grieving boy who needed compassion and understanding. And you failed him. Lindsay looked up at him, her face crumpled with guilt and fear. What happens now? She asked, her voice trembling. Evan took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair. He didn't know the answer to that. All he knew was that things couldn't go back to the way they were. Tyler deserved better, and Evan had to make sure his son felt safe in his own home. I don't know, Evan said finally, his voice tired. But for now, I think you need to leave. Lindsay's eyes widened in shock. What, you're throwing me out? I'm not throwing you out, Evan said, though the words felt bitter on his tongue. I'm asking you to leave for Tyler's sake. He needs to feel safe here, and right now, with you in the house, that's not possible. Lindsay stood up, her face pale. You're choosing him over me, she said, her voice rising with disbelief. He's my son, Evan replied firmly, and I will always choose him. You knew that when we got married, Lindsay. Lindsay stared at him for a long moment, her face twisted with a mix of anger and hurt. But deep down, she knew Evan was right. She had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Fine, she said, her voice flat. I'll pack a bag. Evan watched as she left the kitchen, her footsteps echoing through the quiet house. He felt a deep sense of sadness, not just for the loss of their marriage, but for the damage that had been done to his family. He had failed Tyler once, but he wouldn't fail him again. The days after Lindsay left were a mix of relief and uncertainty. The house felt emptier, but also more peaceful. Tyler spent most of his time in his room, still processing everything that had happened. Evan took time off work to stay home, knowing that his son needed him now more than ever. Tyler was quiet at first, reluctant to talk about what had happened. Evan didn't push him, but he made sure to be present, to let Tyler know he was there whenever his son was ready. Slowly, Tyler began to open up. It's not your fault, Evan said one afternoon, as they sat at the kitchen table eating sandwiches. None of this was your fault, Tyler. Tyler looked down at his plate, picking at the crust of his sandwich. I feel like it is, he said quietly. Lindsay wouldn't have done that if I wasn't so broken. Evan's heart clenched at his son's words. You're not broken, he said firmly. You're grieving, and that's not something you can just snap out of. Lindsay was wrong, Tyler. She was wrong to treat you that way, and she was wrong to kick you out. None of this is on you. Tyler didn't respond, but Evan could see the conflict in his eyes, the struggle to believe that he wasn't at fault. It would take time, Evan knew. Healing wasn't something that happened overnight. At the suggestion of their neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, Evan arranged for Tyler to see a therapist, Dr. Megan Andrews. At first, Tyler resisted, uncomfortable with the idea of talking to a stranger about his feelings. But after a few sessions, he started to open up, finding it easier to talk to someone who wasn't directly involved in his life. Dr. Andrews helped Tyler work through the trauma of his mother's death and the abandonment he felt from Lindsay. She taught him coping mechanisms for dealing with his anxiety and his feelings of worthlessness. Slowly but surely, Tyler began to heal. At home, Evan made a concerted effort to be more present. He cut back on his work hours, making sure he was home for dinner every night. He and Tyler started cooking together, something they hadn't done in years. It was a small act, but it became a form of therapy for both of them, chopping vegetables, stirring pots, and sharing quiet moments together. Evan also made sure they spent time outside the house. Every weekend, they went on what Tyler jokingly called Adventure Day, hiking in nearby parks, exploring new parts of the city, or trying out new restaurants. It was a way for them to bond, to create new memories that weren't tainted by the past. Tyler slowly began to come out of his shell. He started smiling more, laughing at his father's terrible jokes, and even reconnected with some of his old friends. His nightmares became less frequent, though there were still nights when he would wake up in a panic, only to be reassured by Evan's presence. Evan, too, felt the weight of guilt and regret start to lift. He knew he had made mistakes. He had been too focused on work, too absent when Tyler needed him most. But he was determined to make up for that now, to be the father Tyler deserved. They still had a long way to go, but for the first time in a long time, Evan felt hopeful. They were healing together. A few weeks after Lindsay left, she reached out to Evan, asking for a meeting. She wanted to talk, to explain herself, to apologize. Evan was hesitant at first. He didn't want to reopen old wounds, but he also knew that for Tyler's sake, they needed closure. He sat Tyler down one evening after dinner. "Lindsay wants to meet," he said gently. "She wants to apologize." Tyler's face tightened, fear flickering in his eyes. "I don't want to see her," he said quietly. Evan nodded. "You don't have to, if you're not ready. But I think it might help to hear her out, to get some closure." Tyler was silent for a long moment, staring at his hands. "What if she doesn't mean it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if she's just saying it to make herself feel better?" Evan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "That's a possibility," he admitted. "But forgiveness isn't for her, Tyler. It's for you. You don't have to forget what she did, and you don't even have to trust her again. But if you can forgive her, it might help you move forward." Tyler thought about it for a while before finally nodding. "Okay," he said. "I'll talk to her." The meeting was set for the following weekend at a small cafe in town. Evan and Tyler arrived first, sitting at a table near the back. Tyler fidgeted nervously, picking at the sleeve of his jacket. Evan reached over and squeezed his shoulder. "You don't have to say anything you don't want to," Evan said softly. "I'm right here." Tyler nodded, but the tension in his body was palpable. When Lindsay arrived, she looked nervous too. Her eyes were red, her face pale. She sat down across from them, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Tyler," she began, her voice shaky, "I'm so sorry for what I did. Two don't know how to make it right, but I want you to know that I regret everything. I was wrong. I was angry, and I took it out on you, and that wasn't fair. I hope you can forgive me." Tyler stared at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Evan thought he might not say anything, but then Tyler spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "I don't hate you," Tyler said, "but I don't know if I can ever forgive you for what you did. You made me feel like I didn't belong in my own home." Lindsay's eyes filled with tears. "I know," she whispered, "and I'm so sorry." Tyler was silent for a long moment, and Evan held his breath, waiting for what his son would say next. Finally, Tyler sighed. "I forgive you," he said softly. "But I don't want to see you again." Lindsay's face crumpled, but she nodded, understanding. "To understand," she said, her voice breaking. "Thank you, Tyler. I'm sorry." She stood up, wiping at her eyes, and quickly left the cafe. Evan watched her go, his emotions conflicted. But when he turned back to Tyler, he saw something in his son's face that he hadn't seen in a long time. Peace. "Are you okay?" Evan asked gently. Tyler nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Yeah," he said softly. "I think I am." As they left the cafe and walked back to the car, Evan felt a sense of closure settle over him. They had faced the storm, and they had survived. Now it was time to move forward together. The weeks following Lindsay's departure marked the beginning of a new chapter for Evan and Tyler. The house, once filled with tension and strained silences, now felt lighter, like a burden had been lifted. With Lindsay gone, they no longer had to walk on eggshells around each other. The oppressive weight that had hung over their home had dissipated, leaving space for something new healing. Evan had expected Tyler to be a little shaken after the meeting with Lindsay, but instead, his son seemed more at ease. It was as if letting go of the anger and pain had freed him in a way that even Evan hadn't anticipated. Tyler had made it clear that he didn't want Lindsay in his life anymore, and Evan respected that. He didn't press the issue. What mattered now was helping Tyler continue on his path to recovery. One morning, as they sat at the kitchen table eating breakfast together, Evan broached the subject of making changes around the house. "Tyler, I was thinking maybe it's time we made this place feel more like home again," Evan said, glancing around at the familiar surroundings. The house still bore traces of Lindsay's presents decorations she had chosen, furniture she had picked out. It was time for a fresh start. Tyler looked up from his cereal, curiosity in his eyes. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Evan said with a smile, "we could redecorate, pick out some new furniture, maybe paint the walls, make it our own. What do you think?" For a moment, Tyler seemed unsure, but then a small smile tugged at the corners of his lips. "Yeah," he said, nodding. "That sounds good." They spent the next few weekends browsing furniture stores, flipping through paint samples, and working on small DIY projects together. It was the first time in a long while that they had done something just for themselves, something that wasn't about fixing the past, but about building a future. Tyler took an interest in decorating his room, choosing colors and furnishings that reflected his personal style. Evan was happy to let him take the lead, watching with pride as his son embraced the idea of creating a space that felt like his own. It was more than just picking out furniture, it was a step toward reclaiming his sense of belonging. As they worked together, they shared stories and jokes, their conversations no longer tinged with the sadness and uncertainty that had once been so prevalent. Evan couldn't remember the last time he had seen Tyler so at ease, so engaged with life. It filled him with hope for the future, hope that they were truly on the path to healing. One evening, as they stood back to admire their newly painted living room, Tyler turned to Evan with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he said, "this place actually feels like home again." Evan smiled, resting a hand on his son's shoulder. "It is home, Tyler," he said softly, "and it always will be." The transformation that had begun with their home soon extended to other aspects of Tyler's life. With the weight of his past beginning to lift, he started to engage more fully in school and with his friends. Evan noticed the change almost immediately. Tyler's grades improved, and he started talking about his future in a way that he hadn't before. One day, as they sat together in the living room, Tyler casually mentioned an interest in joining the debate club at school. It was something Evan hadn't expected. Tyler had always been quiet, more of an observer than a talker, but he could see the excitement in his son's eyes. "Debate club, huh?" Evan asked, raising an eyebrow. "That's a big step." Tyler shrugged, but there was a flicker of nervous excitement in his expression. "Yeah, I thought maybe it could be fun, and I'm kinda good at arguing," he added with a sheepish smile. Evan chuckled. "I've noticed." Tyler's interest in debate quickly grew into a passion. He threw himself into preparing for the meetings, researching topics, and practicing his speeches. Evan could see the confidence blossoming in him, the way he stood a little taller, spoke with more certainty. It was a side of Tyler that had been dormant for so long, and seeing it come to life made Evan proud beyond words. Tyler's friends also noticed the change. He reconnected with his old group, and soon enough, they were spending afternoons at the house, hanging out and playing video games. The house, which had once been a place of quiet isolation, was now filled with laughter and the easy banter of teenagers. One day, Tyler's friend Daniel came over to shoot hoops in the driveway. Evan watched from the porch, sipping his coffee as the boys played. He hadn't seen Tyler this carefree in years. It reminded him of the days before everything had changed, before Emily's death had cast a shadow over their lives. When the game was over, Tyler jogged over to Evan, wiping sweat from his forehead. "You should come play with us, Dad," he said with a grin. "You've still got some game left in you, right?" Evan laughed, setting down his coffee. "Oh, you think you can take me on? I might be old, but I can still hold my own." The two of them played for a while, and though Tyler had the upper hand when it came to speed, Evan still had his old moves. They laughed and joked, the easy camaraderie between them a testament to how far they had come. That night, as they sat on the couch watching a movie, Tyler suddenly turned to Evan with a serious expression. "Dad," he said hesitantly, "I just want you to know I don't blame you for what happened. With Lindsay, I mean." Evan paused the movie, turning to face his son. "Thank you for saying that, Tyler. But I still feel like I failed you. I should have seen what was happening, should have been there more." Tyler shook his head. "You couldn't have known. I didn't tell you how bad it was, and I thought I could handle it on my own." Evan's heart ached for his son, for the burden he had carried alone for so long. He reached over and pulled Tyler into a hug. "You don't have to handle anything on your own anymore, okay? We're a team, you and me, no matter what." Tyler hugged him back, and Evan felt a surge of love and pride for the young man his son was becoming. Despite everything he had been through, Tyler was resilient, stronger than Evan had ever imagined. And now they were facing the future together, as a true family. As the one-year anniversary of the incident, as they had taken to calling, Evan noticed Tyler becoming quieter again, more introspective. It wasn't the same kind of withdrawal he had seen before. This time, Tyler wasn't shutting down, but rather processing something deep inside. One evening after dinner, Evan decided to gently broach the subject. They were sitting on the porch swing, watching the sunset, when Evan finally spoke. "You've seemed a little down lately," he said, glancing at Tyler. "Is everything okay?" Tyler was quiet for a moment, then he nodded slowly. "Yeah, I've just been thinking about that night. When Lindsay kicked me out. It feels weird that it's been almost a year." Evan's heart tightened. He hadn't realized how close they were to the anniversary until Tyler brought it up. He had been so focused on moving forward that he hadn't stopped to think about how Tyler might be feeling. "I understand," Evan said softly. "It's normal to feel like that, especially with everything that happened." Tyler looked down at his hands, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. "I've been having flashbacks," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not all the time, but sometimes it feels like I'm back there, like I'm still outside, not knowing where to go." Evan felt a pang of guilt and sadness wash over him. He hated that Tyler had to carry those memories with him, but he also knew that healing wasn't a straight line. There would be ups and downs, moments of peace and moments of pain. "Tyler," Evan said gently, "you're safe now. You're home, and I'm not going anywhere." Tyler nodded, but Evan could see the weight of the past still lingering in his eyes. "I was thinking," Tyler said slowly, "maybe we could do something on that day. Not to celebrate, but just to mark how far we've come. So it's not just this terrible day that haunts me." Evan smiled, feeling a swell of pride for his son's resilience and maturity. "That's a great idea," he said. "What did you have in mind?" After some discussion, they decided to spend the day giving back to the community. Tyler suggested volunteering at a local homeless shelter, a place where people who had experienced the same kind of uncertainty and fear he had faced could find help and support. The day arrived, and they spent it serving meals, sorting donations, and talking with the shelter residents. Tyler was quiet at first, but as the day went on, Evan saw him open up. He connected with some of the younger residents, sharing his story in a way that was both vulnerable and empowering. Evan watched in awe as his son, who had been through so much, found the strength to offer hope and encouragement to others. By the time they left the shelter, both of them were exhausted, but there was a sense of fulfillment that couldn't be denied. As they drove home in the fading light of the evening, Tyler turned to Evan, his expression serious but content. "Dad," he said, his voice steady, "I'm okay." "Really? What happened was terrible, but look at us now. We're stronger than ever." Evan felt tears prick his eyes as he nodded, his chest swelling with pride. "We are," he agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so proud of you, Tyler. You're the strongest person I know." Tyler smiled, and as they pulled into the driveway, Evan felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. The past year had been filled with pain, growth, and healing, but through it all, they had come out stronger together. That night, as Evan lay in bed, reflecting on the day, he felt a profound sense of hope for the future. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew that he and Tyler would face them side by side, their bond unbreakable. A few years had passed since the day they volunteered at the shelter, and life had continued to evolve for Evan and Tyler. Their relationship had grown even stronger, built on a foundation of trust, love, and mutual respect. They had created new traditions, new memories, and a new sense of home that was filled with warmth and joy. Tyler had graduated high school with honors and had been accepted to a nearby college where he was studying political science, his passion for debate and public speaking having blossomed into a career path. He still came home on weekends, and they would spend hours talking about his classes, his dreams, and the future. Evan had made a conscious decision to scale back his work permanently. He now worked part-time as a consultant, which allowed him the flexibility to be there for Tyler and for himself. He had also gotten involved in community projects, continuing the work they had started at the shelter. Their house, once a place of tension and grief, was now a haven of peace. The walls were adorned with Tyler's artwork, something he had started doing as a form of therapy, and family photos that reminded them both of how far they had come. One particular corner of the living room held a small memorial to Emily, Tyler's mother. It had taken them a long time to find the strength to talk about her openly. But as they healed, they realized that keeping her memory alive was an important part of their journey. On her birthday and the anniversary of her death, they would share stories about her, laughing and sometimes crying, but always remembering the love she had brought into their lives. As Evan stood in the living room one evening, looking at the photos and artwork that filled the walls, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. Life hadn't been easy, but it had brought him and Tyler closer than he had ever thought possible. Their family, though small, was stronger than ever. Tyler walked into the room, interrupting Evan's thoughts. "Dad," he said with a smile, "you ready for movie night?" Evan smiled, pulling his son into a quick hug. "Yeah, I'm ready." As they settled onto the couch, the house filled with the sound of laughter and easy conversation. Evan knew that they had weathered the storm and come out on the other side stronger, more connected, and filled with hope. Their future was bright, and together they could face anything that came their way. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey of resilience, healing, and hope. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more like it, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Your support helps us bring more heartfelt stories to life. Like, share, and comment. Below would love to hear your thoughts on Evan and Tyler's journey. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story. You've given her something so many people don't get: a friend who truly cares. Luke blinked back tears, trying to hold himself together. "I just want her to be okay." Megan nodded. "I know. We all do." The next day, something changed. It was subtle at first, just a slight improvement in Edith's vital signs. The nurses noticed it during their routine checks, and by the afternoon, Dr. Fields had confirmed that the antibiotics were starting to take effect. The infection, while still serious, was beginning to recede. Luke could hardly believe it when he heard the news. After so many hours of uncertainty and fear, this tiny glimmer of hope felt like a lifeline. He stayed close by Edith's side, watching her closely for any sign of improvement. Her breathing became a little steadier, her color slightly better, and though she remained unconscious, there was a sense that her body was fighting back. Dr. Fields approached Luke later that afternoon, his expression more hopeful than it had been in days. "She's not out of the woods yet," he cautioned, "but we're seeing some positive changes. Her body is responding to the treatment, and if things continue on this trajectory, there's a chance she'll pull through." Luke felt a rush of relief, though he was careful not to get his hopes too high. There was still a long way to go, but for the first time in days, he allowed himself to believe that Edith might survive this. That evening, Luke sat by her bedside again, his fingers gently brushing against hers. He had taken to reading to her from one of her favorite books, Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. It was one of the few books that Edith had talked about in their many conversations, a novel she had read countless times over the years. As he read aloud, his voice quiet but steady, Luke imagined that Edith could hear him. He hoped that his voice, familiar and comforting, would reach through the haze of her unconsciousness and give her strength. He wanted her to know that she wasn't alone, that he was still there, fighting alongside her. As the night wore on, something remarkable happened. Edith's fingers twitched in his hand, a small but unmistakable movement. Luke's heart skipped a beat, and he paused, staring down at her hand in disbelief. "Edith," he whispered, his voice filled with hope. There was no further movement, but the slight twitch had been enough to fill Luke with renewed optimism. He called for the nurse, who confirmed that Edith's condition was indeed improving. It was slow, and she still had a long way to go, but she was beginning to wake up. Over the next several days, Edith's recovery progressed. Her body, weakened by the infection and the cancer, continued to fight back, and slowly but surely, she began to regain consciousness. The day she opened her eyes for the first time since the setback, Luke was there, holding her hand and whispering words of encouragement. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment she looked disoriented, her gaze unfocused. But then her eyes found Luke's, and a flicker of recognition passed over her face. "Luke," she whispered, her voice weak but filled with emotion. Luke felt tears well up in his eyes as he squeezed her hand. "I'm here, Edith," he said, his voice shaking. "I'm right here." Edith blinked slowly, her lips curving into the faintest smile. "You stayed." "Of course I stayed," Luke replied, his throat tight with emotion. "I'm not going anywhere." For the first time in weeks, Luke felt a sense of relief wash over him. Edith was awake. She was still fragile, still fighting, but she was alive. And that was all that mattered. As the days passed, Edith grew stronger. She was moved out of the ICU and into a regular room where she continued her recovery. Luke visited her every day, just as he had before. And each time he saw her, she looked a little better, her skin a little less pale, her voice a little stronger. It was a slow process, but there was progress. One afternoon, as Luke sat by her bedside, Edith looked at him with a tired but grateful expression. "You saved my life, Luke," she said quietly, her voice filled with sincerity. Luke shook his head, his heart full of emotion. "No, Edith, you saved your own life. You fought through all of this. I was just here to make sure you didn't have to do it alone." Edith smiled softly, tears glistening in her eyes. "I couldn't have done it without you." For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of everything they had been through settling over them. It had been a long, difficult journey, one filled with fear, uncertainty, and pain. But they had made it through together. As Edith's condition continued to improve, the doctors began discussing her discharge plans. She would still need ongoing treatment for her cancer, but the immediate danger had passed, and she was strong enough to leave the hospital. It was a moment both Luke and Edith had been waiting for, though it came with its own set of challenges. "I can't go back to living alone," Edith admitted one afternoon, her voice tinged with sadness. "I don't have the strength to take care of myself like I used to." Luke nodded, understanding her concerns. "Well, figure it out," he said gently. "You don't have to do this alone. There are options care facilities, home health aides. We'll find a solution." Edith looked thoughtful, her eyes distant. "I've been thinking about it a lot, and I think it's time to let go of the house. It's too much for me now. I've held on to it because of Harold, but I think it's time." Luke's heart ached at the sadness in her voice, but he knew she was right. Edith had spent so many years in that house, filling it with memories of her life with Harold. But now she needed a new beginning, a fresh start, where she could focus on her health and well-being. "We'll find you a good place," Luke said softly. "Somewhere where you'll be comfortable and well taken care of. And I'll visit you every day." Edith smiled at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I know you will." In the weeks that followed, Luke and Edith worked together to find a care facility where she could live comfortably while receiving the medical support she needed. It wasn't an easy decision, but Edith felt at peace with it. She knew she wasn't saying goodbye to the life she had built in Riverbrook, she was simply starting a new chapter. The day Edith moved into the facility, Luke was by her side, helping her settle in and bringing her familiar items from home, her favorite quilt, a framed photo of her and Harold, and a stack of books she loved. The room was small but cozy, with a view of a garden outside the window. Edith seemed at ease, and Luke felt a sense of relief knowing she was in a place where she would be cared for. As he sat with her that afternoon, watching the sunlight stream through the window, Luke realized just how much Edith had come to mean to him. She wasn't just a resident on his mail route, she was family. And no matter what the future held, he would be there for her, just as she had always been there for him. Several months had passed since Edith had moved into her new home, and life in Riverbrook had returned to its quiet rhythm. The seasons had changed, bringing the warmth of summer to the town. Luke continued his mail route, greeting the familiar faces of the town's residents and enjoying the simple pleasures of his routine. But there was something different, now a deeper connection to the community and a sense of purpose that went beyond delivering mail. Every afternoon, Luke visited Edith at the care facility. They spent hours talking, laughing, and reminiscing about the past. Edith had made new friends at the facility, and her health had stabilized. She was still undergoing treatment for her cancer, but she was stronger now, and there was a lightness in her spirit that hadn't been there before. One sunny afternoon, as Luke sat with Edith in the garden outside the facility, she turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "You know, Luke," she said softly, "I've been thinking a lot about how lucky I am. I've had a good life, but what I'm most grateful for is the people I've met along the way, people like you." Luke smiled, his heart full of warmth. "I'm the lucky one, Edith. You've taught me so much about resilience, about kindness, about what it means to really care about someone." Edith reached out and took his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You saved me, Luke. Not just my life, but my spirit. I was lost for a long time, but you helped me find my way back." Luke felt tears prick his eyes, but he blinked them away, squeezing her hand in return. "We helped each other." As they sat there in the warm afternoon sun, surrounded by the scent of blooming flowers and the soft rustling of leaves, Luke realized that he had found something he hadn't even known he was looking for: a sense of belonging, a deeper connection to the people around him, and a renewed understanding of what it meant to be part of a community. The story of Edith's struggle and her eventual recovery had touched more lives than either of them could have imagined. The people of Riverbrook had rallied around her, showing what it meant to truly care for one another. And in the process, they had reminded Luke of the importance of small, everyday acts of kindness, the kind of kindness that could save lives. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the garden, Edith leaned back in her chair, her eyes twinkling with contentment. "It's a beautiful day," she said softly. Luke nodded, his heart full. "It really is." And in that moment, Luke knew that no matter what the future held, he and Edith would face it together, surrounded by the strength of their community and the unbreakable bond they had formed. Sometimes, the most unexpected connections can shape our lives in profound ways. If you've been moved by this story and want to hear more heartwarming tales like this one, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss any future updates. Every story has the power to inspire, and we have plenty more to share with you. Join us on this journey of storytelling, empathy, and community. Be a part of something bigger by subscribing, and together we can spread positivity, one story at a time. Let me know how it goes. In the months that followed, Ryan spearheaded a new task force within the department aimed at ensuring the responsible use of technology in policing. The Ethical Policing Technology Initiative (EPTI) was designed to oversee how new tools were implemented, making sure they adhered to strict privacy standards and weren't being used in a discriminatory manner. Ryan worked closely with civil liberties groups, tech experts, and community leaders to develop guidelines that ensured transparency and accountability. Officers were required to undergo specialized training on how to use these tools ethically, and new oversight measures were put in place to monitor their deployment. The program wasn't without its critics. Some officers complained that the new rules made their jobs harder, while certain tech companies pushed back against what they saw as unnecessary restrictions. But Ryan stood firm, knowing that without proper oversight, the technology could do more harm than good. During one particularly tense department meeting, an officer raised his hand, frustration evident in his voice. "With all due respect, Deputy Chief," he began, Why are we handcuffing ourselves? This technology can help us catch criminals faster. Why put so many restrictions on it? Ryan met the officer's gaze, understanding the concern but remaining resolute. Because our job isn't just to catch criminals, he said. Our job is to protect the people. And that means protecting their rights, too. If we start sacrificing privacy and civil liberties in the name of efficiency, then we're not doing our jobs. We're just cutting corners. The room was silent for a moment, and Ryan could see the wheels turning in the officer's mind. It was a tough balancing act, but Ryan knew it was necessary. The future of policing wasn't about brute force or unchecked surveillance. It was about thoughtful, ethical approaches that respected the people they served. 2 years later, the Ethical Policing Technology Initiative had become a model for departments across the country. Ryan had been invited to speak at several national conferences, sharing the lessons they had learned about balancing public safety with civil liberties. The success of the initiative had solidified his reputation as a forward-thinking leader in law enforcement reform. Jordan, too, had continued his advocacy work, pushing for nationwide adoption of similar standards. The two men, despite their different approaches, remained close friends and collaborators, each pushing the other to do better. One evening, after a long day, Ryan received a message from Jordan: dinner at my place. When Ryan arrived, Jordan was already grilling steaks on the back porch. The smell of sizzling meat filled the air as they sat down to catch up. "You know, I never thought we'd be here," Jordan said as they ate. "When we started all this, I didn't think we'd actually get to a point where the system would listen to us." Ryan smiled. "I think we both underestimated the power of persistence." Jordan laughed. "You're right about that. But we're not done yet, are we?" "No," Ryan said, his tone serious. "We're not. But we're making progress." They clinked their beer bottles together, a silent toast to the years of hard work and the victories they had earned. The road had been long and filled with obstacles, but they had made a difference, one step at a time. As the sun set over the city, casting a warm glow over the skyline, Ryan and Jordan sat in comfortable silence, watching the world they had helped shape. The challenges they had faced, the battles they had fought, had all been worth it. They had built something lasting, something that would continue long after they were gone. Ryan couldn't help but think about the young officers coming up through the ranks, the ones who would carry on the work he had started. Officers like Naomi Green, who now led a unit focused on community engagement, were the future of policing. They represented a new generation that believed in fairness, justice, and the importance of doing things the right way. "I think the future's in good hands," Ryan said, more to himself than to Jordan. Jordan looked over at him, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, I think it is." The two men sat back, content in the knowledge that while their work was never truly done, they had laid a foundation that would stand the test of time. And as long as there were people willing to stand up for what was right, there would always be hope for a better, more just world. A few more years passed, and Ryan Carter's career had reached heights he never imagined when he first joined the force. Now, as the chief of police, Ryan was responsible not only for the reforms that had already taken place, but also for leading the department through new social, technological, and ethical challenges. His success as a reformer had made him a widely respected figure, but it had also placed him under intense scrutiny. Every move he made, every decision he authorized, was dissected by the media and the public. The new debate consuming the city was centered around the rise in community-led safety initiatives. Many neighborhoods, particularly those that had experienced tense relations with the police in the past, were advocating for more localized, community-based public safety programs. These initiatives emphasized conflict resolution, mental health intervention, and restorative justice over traditional policing methods. Ryan understood the community's desire to have a more direct role in keeping their neighborhoods safe. After all, much of the progress they had made over the years was due to increased collaboration between the police and the public. But there were concerns within the department about the implications of scaling back traditional policing in favor of untested community models. One afternoon, as Ryan sat reviewing proposals for community-led initiatives, his deputy, Lieutenant Denise Martin walked into his office. Denise had been one of Ryan's strongest allies during the reform years, helping him navigate the pushback from the old guard while building support among the rank-and-file officers. "Chief, you've seen the latest push from the city council, right?" Denise asked, a hint of concern in her voice. Ryan nodded, gesturing for her to take a seat. "Yeah, I've been going over it. Community Safety Initiative, they're calling it. They want to divert some funding from the police budget to support it." Denise frowned. "I get where they're coming from, but are they really ready for this? We're talking about removing traditional law enforcement presence in some of the most at-risk neighborhoods. Are we setting them up to fail?" Ryan leaned back in his chair, thinking carefully before responding. "I don't think we should look at it as us versus them. The goal is the same: keeping people safe. The way we've done things isn't the only way to do it. But if we're going to make this work, we need to be partners in the process." Denise nodded, her expression softening. "You think we can pull that off?" Ryan smiled slightly. "We've done harder things." A few days later, Ryan met with Councilwoman Elena Reyes, one of the main architects of the Community Safety Initiative. The two had worked together closely on previous reforms, but this new initiative was pushing them into uncharted territory. Still, Ryan was determined to keep the lines of communication open. Chief Carter, Councilwoman Reyes, greeted him warmly as they sat down in her office. "Thank you for taking the time. I know this isn't an easy conversation." Ryan smiled. "That's why we're here to have the hard conversations. We both want the same thing: safer communities." Reyes nodded, her tone more serious now. "Exactly. But we believe that safety doesn't always have to come from a police presence. These community programs have been shown to reduce violence and increase trust between residents. We want to give people the tools to resolve conflicts without always having to rely on law enforcement." Ryan took a deep breath. "I understand that, and I think there's a lot of potential here. But we also need to make sure that when people call for help, they get the response they need. There are situations where trained law enforcement is necessary, when violence escalates or when people's lives are at risk. We can't ignore that reality." Reyes leaned forward, her eyes thoughtful. "That's why we need your help. We're not talking about eliminating police presence, we're talking about complementing it. Working together with the community instead of always being the first line of defense." Ryan nodded. "I'm open to that. Let's figure out how we can build this partnership. But we need clear guidelines on when the police should step in and when the community can handle things on their own. We also need to make sure that officers aren't feeling like they're being sidelined. If we're going to shift some of the responsibility, we need to bring everyone to the table." Reyes smiled. "That's exactly what I was hoping to hear." Over the next few months, the Community Safety Initiative took shape. Ryan and his team worked closely with the City Council and community leaders to design a pilot program that would test the new model in several neighborhoods. The initiative focused on training community members in conflict resolution, mental health first aid, and de-escalation tactics, while keeping a close line of communication with the police for situations that required their involvement. Jordan, ever the advocate for grassroots solutions, was thrilled with the progress. "This is exactly what we've been talking about for years," Jordan said one evening over dinner with Ryan. "Empowering the community to take ownership of their own safety. If this works, it could be a game changer." Ryan nodded, though he remained cautious. "I want it to work as much as you do. But we have to be prepared for things to go wrong, too. If the community doesn't feel supported, or if the police feel like they're being cut out of the process, this could backfire." Jordan raised his glass. "That's why we have you keeping everyone on the same page." Ryan chuckled, clinking his glass against Jordan's. "Let's hope it's enough." As the program rolled out, there were successes and setbacks. In some neighborhoods, the community-led safety efforts resulted in a noticeable decrease in calls for police intervention. People began resolving disputes among themselves, and trust between residents and law enforcement improved. But in other areas, old tensions resurfaced. Some officers felt their authority was being undermined, while certain residents still feared police involvement, leading to hesitations in calling for help when it was really needed. Ryan worked tirelessly to address these issues, meeting with officers and community leaders, adjusting the program as needed. He knew this was part of the growing pains of any new initiative, but he also knew they couldn't afford to let the early successes slip away. The true test of the Community Safety Initiative came one night when a major confrontation erupted between two rival groups in one of the pilot neighborhoods. The conflict had escalated quickly, with rumors of violence spreading through social media. Normally, the police would have responded immediately, but this time, the community leaders who had been trained through the initiative decided to step in first. Ryan and his team were on standby, monitoring the situation closely. He had already instructed the officers to be ready to intervene if things got out of hand. But he was hoping that the community could de-escalate the situation without the need for force. For hours, tensions ran high as the trained mediators worked to calm both sides. The situation was touch and go, but just as things seemed like they were about to erupt into violence, a breakthrough happened. The leaders of both groups agreed to meet, with the mediators acting as go-betweens, and after a tense negotiation, they reached a resolution without a single arrest or injury. When Ryan received the call that the situation had been resolved peacefully, he felt a wave of relief wash over him. "We did it," Denise said, her voice filled with awe as she stood beside Ryan in the precinct's command center. Ryan nodded, his expression serious. "The community did it. We were there to back them up, but they handled it on their own." Jordan called Ryan that night, excited about the news. "This is huge, man, proof that this model works. People are going to take notice." Ryan smiled but remained grounded. "It's a big step, but we have to stay focused. This isn't a one-time thing. We need to keep refining the process, making sure that both the community and the police are working together." Months later, the success of the pilot program had attracted national attention. Cities across the country were interested in replicating the model, and Ryan was once again at the forefront of a new wave of reform. This time, the focus wasn't just on how police could change, but on how entire communities could take ownership of their safety while still collaborating with law enforcement. Jordan, as always, remained by Ryan's side, helping to push the legal framework for these initiatives across the country. The two friends had come a long way from that fateful night they had been pulled over. Their partnership had transformed the city and was now shaping the future of public safety nationwide. As Ryan sat in his office preparing for yet another interview with a national news outlet about the program's success, he couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. The road hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges ahead. But they had built something lasting, something that would change lives for generations to come. Looking out the window at the city he had dedicated his life to, Ryan smiled. The work was never done, but for the first time, he felt truly optimistic about the future. They had started with a fight for justice, but now they were building a future of hope, partnership, and community-led safety. And as long as people were willing to work together, Ryan knew that anything was possible. A few years had passed since the Community Safety Initiative had been fully implemented across the city. The initiative had matured, becoming an example of how community and law enforcement could work together in harmony without one undermining the other. While there were still challenges, the overwhelming success had drawn attention from policymakers, activists, and law enforcement agencies across the country. Ryan Carter, now nearing retirement age, was in a reflective mood. After decades of service, he knew his time as the city's police chief was coming to an end. And while he looked forward to stepping back from the pressures of the job, he also felt the weight of leaving behind a legacy. Jordan, meanwhile, had taken his advocacy work to a national level. He was now leading efforts to pass federal legislation aimed at reshaping policing standards across the United States. They were both busy men, but their friendship remained as strong as ever. One evening, as Ryan sat at his kitchen table going over the plans for his final year in office, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Jordan. "Need to talk. Big news. Let's meet tomorrow." Ryan smiled to himself. Jordan always had big news. Over the years, they had shared so many victories, setbacks, and countless moments of celebration and frustration. But it was their shared vision that had kept them moving forward. The next day, Ryan met Jordan at a small diner they used to frequent in their early days as young professionals. It felt nostalgic, sitting in the same booth where they had once dreamed of making a difference. Now, years later, they had done more than dream, they had transformed their city. "All right, Jordan, what's this big news?" Ryan asked as he settled into the booth. Jordan leaned forward, his eyes bright with excitement. "I've been talking with some of the top people in Washington. They want to take what we've done here with the Community Safety Initiative and turn it into a national pilot program. It'll be the first time this kind of community-driven public safety model has been tested on such a large scale." Ryan sat back, absorbing the news. "National pilot program? That's huge. What's the plan?" Jordan nodded enthusiastically. "They're looking for cities willing to try it. We'd take the model we built and expand it, tweaking it based on the unique needs of different communities. They want to bring me on as a national advisor, but more importantly, they want your input." Ryan raised an eyebrow. "My input? I'm about to retire, Jordan. I'm not sure I'm the guy for this." Jordan shook his head, a grin spreading across his face. "You're exactly the guy for this. You've seen this work on the ground. You've lived it. And the fact that you've been in law enforcement gives you the credibility to convince other departments that this isn't just some idealistic dream, it's real. And it works." Ryan rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "It's a big ask. I've spent my entire career in this city. I'm not sure I'm ready for something on that scale." Jordan leaned in, his voice quieter now. "I know you're ready to step back, but think about it. This could be the final piece of the puzzle scaling this idea across the country. You could retire knowing that what we built here is making an impact everywhere. Just give it some thought." Ryan didn't respond immediately, but he knew Jordan had a point. The work they had started in their city had the potential to be something even greater. But after years of leading a department, Ryan wasn't sure if he had the energy for another national fight. "You'll think about it," Ryan said finally, his tone cautious. Jordan smiled. "That's all I'm asking." As Ryan approached the end of his tenure as police chief, he began preparing his department for the transition. He had mentored several officers who were strong candidates to succeed him, including Lieutenant Denise Martin, who had proven herself to be a capable leader and a dedicated advocate for the community-first approach they had built. One afternoon, Ryan called Denise into his office. "Denise, you've been one of the strongest leaders in this department for years," Ryan said, looking across his desk at her. "I've been thinking a lot about the future, and I believe you're ready to take the reins." Denise's eyes widened slightly, though she had suspected this moment was coming. "Chief, that means a lot. I've learned so much from you, and I believe in what we've built together. But I know there's still so much more to do." Ryan nodded, his face thoughtful. "That's exactly why I know you're the right person for this. You've always been driven by the same things that pushed me: justice, fairness, and a commitment to serving the people. This department needs someone like you to keep it moving forward." Denise sat in silence for a moment, the weight of Ryan's words settling on her shoulders. "Thank you, Chief. I won't let you down." "I know you won't," Ryan said, his voice filled with quiet confidence. "And remember, you're not doing this alone. Lean on your team, and don't be afraid to keep pushing for change, even when it's hard." As Denise left the office, Ryan felt a sense of peace. The future of the department was in good hands. It was time for him to step back and let the next generation lead. With his retirement officially announced, Ryan took a few weeks to reflect on Jordan's proposal. The idea of taking the Community Safety Initiative to a national level intrigued him, but he was also ready for a quieter life after years of public service. He spent more time with his family, enjoying the slower pace, but the thought of leaving the work behind nagged at him. One evening, Ryan found himself sitting on his back porch, the sun setting over the city skyline. The phone buzzed, and he saw a message from Jordan. "Still waiting on you, old man." "Time's ticking." Ryan chuckled to himself, shaking his head. Jordan never gave up on a fight. That night, Ryan made his decision. He wasn't ready to walk away from it all just yet. The work they had started was too important, and if there was a chance to make a lasting impact on a national scale, he wanted to be a part of it. The next morning, Ryan called Jordan. "All right, I'm in. Let's do this." Jordan's voice was filled with triumph. "I knew you couldn't resist. This is going to be big, Ryan. We're about to change the game." With the decision made, Ryan found himself in Washington, D.C., meeting with lawmakers, community leaders, and law enforcement officials from across the country. The national pilot program was being rolled out in 10 major cities, and Ryan was instrumental in helping to shape its implementation. His experience in building the initiative from the ground up gave him a unique perspective, and his input was invaluable as they adapted the program to fit the specific needs of different communities. Jordan, as always, was right there with him, leading the charge from the legal side and ensuring that the program stayed true to its original goals of fairness, justice, and community empowerment. As the months passed, Ryan found himself energized by the work. He had thought he was ready for retirement, but this new mission gave him a renewed sense of purpose. The challenges were immense, but so were the rewards.
He watched his communities begin to embrace the new model as officers and residents, and as the seeds of change spread from city to city.
2 years into the national pilot program, the results were undeniable. The Community Safety Initiative had reduced violent incidents, built stronger bonds between law enforcement and residents, and empowered communities to take control of their own safety. The program was hailed as a success, and plans were already underway to expand it to even more cities. Ryan, now in his mid-60s, knew it was finally time to step back for good. His work was done. He had helped lay the foundation for a new era of policing and community collaboration, and he had no doubt that the leaders who followed would continue to build on that legacy. As he stood on the steps of the Capitol, watching the latest round of national reforms being signed into law, Ryan felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had spent his life fighting for justice, for fairness, and for a better future. And now that future was being realized. Jordan stood beside him, grinning. "Well, old man, we did it." Ryan smiled, his eyes reflecting both pride and relief. "Yeah, we did." They stood there together, watching the crowds below, knowing that their fight had been worth it. The road had been long, the challenges immense, but they had built something lasting, something that would shape the future for generations to come. And in that moment, Ryan knew that while his journey as a public servant was over, his legacy of justice, reform, and hope would live on. Ryan Carter had officially retired from his role as chief of police and had successfully completed his work on the national pilot program. Now, standing on the balcony of his home in Denver, he gazed out over the city that had shaped his life. After decades of service, he was finally stepping away from the day-to-day grind of law enforcement. But it didn't feel like the end. In many ways, it felt like a new beginning. Without the constant pressures of his old position, Ryan found himself reconnecting with old hobbies and passions that he hadn't had time for in years. He spent more time with his family, his wife Elena, and their 2 grown children, Tyler and Sophia. The past few years had been especially hard on them with Ryan's intense focus on work, and now he wanted to make up for lost time. One sunny afternoon, Ryan and Elena took a walk through the park, something they hadn't done in what felt like ages. The air was crisp, the leaves falling gently around them, and Ryan felt a sense of peace that he hadn't experienced in years. "You finally have time to slow down," Elena said with a smile as they strolled along the path. Ryan nodded. "It feels strange, but it's nice. I think I forgot what it was like to just be present." Elena squeezed his hand. "You've earned it, but I have a feeling you're not done yet." Ryan smiled, knowing she was right. Even in retirement, his mind still buzzed with thoughts about how he could continue making a difference. But this time, he would do it on his terms, without the constant demands of his old job weighing him down. A few months into his retirement, Ryan was approached by a local university to teach a course on ethical leadership and policing reform. The idea intrigued him. He had spent years putting these principles into practice, but now he had the opportunity to pass that knowledge on to the next generation of leaders. The thought of stepping into a classroom full of eager students, young people, who would one day be responsible for shaping the future of law enforcement, gave Ryan a renewed sense of purpose. He accepted the offer and began preparing for the course. On his first day at the university, Ryan felt a twinge of nervousness as he walked into the lecture hall. The students sat quietly, some of them looking excited, others curious, all waiting for the former police chief who had gained national recognition for his reforms. "Good afternoon," Ryan began, standing at the front of the class. "My name is Ryan Carter, and am here to talk to you about the future of policing." He paused, scanning the room before continuing. "But before we talk about the future, we need to understand the past, the mistakes, the challenges, and the moments when we didn't get it right. Because if we don't learn from those moments, we'll be doomed to repeat them." The room was silent as Ryan spoke, but he could feel the students' attention. Their interest piqued. Over the course of the semester, Ryan shared not just the victories he'd had in his career, but the hard lessons he had learned along the way. He emphasized the importance of empathy, listening, and above all, the responsibility that comes with the badge. Teaching gave Ryan a new outlet for his energy and passion. It wasn't the adrenaline-filled, high-stakes work of policing, but it was just as important. These students were the future, and he was determined to equip them with the tools they needed to lead with integrity. While Ryan was settling into his new role as an educator, Jordan Thompson's star continued to rise. His work on the national level had gained him a reputation as one of the most respected voices in the fight for justice reform. Jordan had helped pass landmark legislation that put ethical limits on the use of surveillance technology, created national standards for police accountability, and expanded community-led safety programs across the country. One afternoon, Jordan called Ryan from his office in Washington, D.C., and with some unexpected news. "Ryan, guess what?" Jordan said, his voice buzzing with excitement. "They want me to run for office." Ryan chuckled. "Who's they? And what office are we talking about here?" Jordan laughed. "A group of people who've been following my work think I should run for Congress. They want me to take this fight from the courtroom to the Capitol." Ryan wasn't entirely surprised. Jordan had always been a fighter, and he had the kind of charisma and conviction that made him a natural leader. "I can't say I didn't see this coming." "Are you thinking about it?" "I am," Jordan admitted. "It's a huge responsibility, but I've been thinking about how much more we could accomplish with the right people in power. If I can push for change at the highest level, why not go for it?" Ryan nodded, though Jordan couldn't see it. "You've always said we need people inside the system to change it from within. This might be your chance to do just that." "I've been thinking the same thing," Jordan replied. "It's a big step, but I think it's the right one." As they talked, Ryan felt a deep sense of pride for his friend. Jordan had spent his life fighting for justice, and now he was on the verge of taking that fight to the national stage. The following year, Jordan launched his campaign for Congress. With his years of legal experience and his proven track record in reform, he quickly gained support from a wide range of voters. His platform focused on criminal justice reform, civil rights, and economic equality issues that had been central to his work for decades. Ryan, though retired, was actively involved in the campaign, offering advice and helping Jordan connect with key community leaders. He traveled with Jordan to campaign events, standing by his side as they continued to push for the changes they had always believed in. On the night of the election, Ryan sat in the campaign's headquarters, surrounded by Jordan's team, watching the results roll in. The energy in the room was electric, but Ryan remained calm, reflecting on everything they had accomplished together. When the final votes were tallied, it was official: Jordan had won the election. The room erupted into cheers, and Jordan was immediately swarmed by supporters and media. But as soon as he had a moment, Jordan made his way through the crowd to Ryan. "We did it, man," Jordan said, grinning from ear to ear. Ryan smiled, shaking his friend's hand before pulling him into a hug. "You did it! I'm proud of you." Jordan nodded, his expression turning serious for a moment. "None of this would have happened without you, Ryan. We've been in this together from the start." As the celebration continued, Ryan couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning of something even bigger. Jordan's election to Congress meant that the work they had started years ago, the fight for justice, fairness, and accountability was now being carried forward on a national level. And while Ryan was stepping back, he knew that the movement would continue to grow, led by people like Jordan, who were ready to take the next steps. As Ryan watched Jordan deliver his victory speech later that night, he felt a sense of closure and fulfillment. The work they had done together had made a lasting impact, not just in their city, but across the country. They had faced countless obstacles, but through it all, they had never given up. Ryan's life was quieter now, but it was filled with meaning. His time teaching at the university continued to bring him joy, and the students he mentored were already starting to make waves in the fields of law enforcement, social justice, and community activism. His influence would live on through them, and through the work Jordan was doing on a national scale. In the end, Ryan realized that the fight for justice never truly ended. It was passed down from one generation to the next, evolving with each new challenge. But he took comfort in knowing that the work would continue long after he was gone. And as he looked toward the future, Ryan Carter was filled with hope that the lessons they had learned, the battles they had fought, and the progress they had made would lead to a world that was fairer, more just, and filled with opportunity for all. As the story draws to a close, we want to thank you for joining us on this powerful journey of justice, friendship, and change. If you enjoyed this story and want more thought-provoking content like this, be sure to subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us continue sharing stories that inspire, challenge, and make a difference. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update, and feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear where you're watching from and what impact this story had on you. Subscribe now for more impactful stories and content that makes you think. We value your feedback, so if you enjoyed this story, leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for being part of our storytelling community, and stay tuned for more stories that remind us all that no matter how hard things get, we are never truly alone.